Welcome, dream seekers and insomniacs. I'm your host, the Night Weaver, guiding you through soul-seeping, mind-haunting stories under a rain-soaked darkness. Now, take a deep breath, let the rhythm of the rain settle you, and follow me into the shadows beyond. When Sarah and her husband Jack found the apartment, it felt like a gift from the universe itself. They'd been searching for months, growing increasingly desperate as rejection after rejection piled up. Each no felt like another nail in the coffin of their dreams of building a life together in the city. They'd only been married a year, still basking in that newlywed glow while simultaneously wrestling with the harsh realities of making ends meet. Every month was a careful dance of budgeting and compromise, stretching dollars until they screamed. Sarah had just started her new job at Wellington Publishing downtown, a junior editor position that promised growth, but started with a salary that barely covered their basic needs. Jack had been piecing together an income through freelance construction work, taking whatever jobs he could find in the city's endless maze of renovation projects. His hands were always rough now, calloused from countless hours of manual labor, but his smile never dimmed when he talked about their future. So when they stumbled across this cozy pre-war apartment with its impossibly low rent, just 2 blocks from her office, it seemed almost too good to be true. The building itself was a beautiful old brownstone, its facade weathered but dignified, with intricate moldings that spoke of a more elegant era. The rental price was so far below market value that Sarah had initially assumed it was a typo. But no, the landlord, a distracted-looking man named Mr. Peterson, assured them it was correct. "Just looking for the right tenants," he'd mumbled, barely making eye contact as he handed them the keys. Something in his manner should have given Sarah pause, but they were too relieved, too eager to finally have a place to call their own. But from the moment they moved in, something felt off. It wasn't anything Sarah could put her finger on at first, just a persistent unease that seemed to hover at the edges of her consciousness. The first thing she noticed was the cold. It wasn't the normal chill you might expect in an old building. This was different, more invasive somehow. Even with the ancient radiators clanking and hissing at full blast, the place maintained a bone-deep coldness that no amount of heating seemed to touch. It was particularly bad in the back room, the one with the mysterious little attic door tucked away in the corner like an afterthought. That attic door fascinated and unsettled Sarah in equal measure. It was a simple wooden door, maybe 3 feet high, with an old-fashioned brass lock that seemed unusually sturdy for what they assumed was just a utility closet. The wood around the lock was darker than the rest of the door, as if countless hands had touched it over the years, testing its strength. The back room was supposed to be Jack's office. He needed a dedicated space for his laptop and drafting table, somewhere he could work on estimates and blueprints for his construction projects. But he could barely stand to be in there for more than an hour at a time. "Feels like a freezer in here," he'd mutter, his breath visible in the air as he rubbed his hands together and shook his head, like someone left a window open in the Arctic. But all the windows were sealed tight, and the radiator in that room worked just as hard as the others. Over the next few weeks, the small things started accumulating, like pieces of a puzzle Sarah didn't want to solve. It's remarkably easy to rationalize away the unexplainable, especially when the alternative is too unsettling to contemplate. Every old building has its quirks, she told herself. The keys that somehow migrated from her purse to the fruit bowl. She must have absent-mindedly placed them there while juggling groceries. The lights that flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Just the ancient wiring showing its age. But then it got weirder, and the comfortable explanations began to wear thin. One night, Sarah woke up to a sound that would become horrifyingly familiar. A faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the walls. It wasn't the random knocking of settling pipes or expanding wood. No, this had a purpose to it, a pattern that spoke of consciousness. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 slow ones, over and over, like someone trying to communicate in some forgotten code. Groggy and disoriented, she nudged Jack, who responded with an incomprehensible mumble and rolled over, pulling the blankets tighter around himself. Sarah lay there in the darkness, listening to that persistent tapping, trying to convince herself it was just the building's nocturnal symphony. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something intentional, like someone desperately knocking to be let out of a space too small for human habitation. The incidents began to escalate, each one harder to explain away than the last. One afternoon, while Jack was out on a job site across town, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen, losing herself in the mundane rhythm of wiping counters and organizing cabinets. As she worked, she gradually became aware of a presence behind her, that prickling sensation of being watched that sets off ancient alarm bells in our primitive brains. She turned around slowly, her heart already picking up speed, and noticed the door to the back room standing ajar. She froze, dish towel clutched in her suddenly trembling hands. She knew. They'd kept it closed. They always kept it closed, an unspoken agreement between Jack and her, as if by shutting that door they could contain whatever lurked behind it. Maybe the latch is loose, she whispered to herself, her voice sounding thin and unconvincing in the empty apartment. She forced herself to walk over and push it shut, trying to ignore the way the temperature dropped with each step closer to that room. As she stepped back, something caught her eye. Tiny, parallel scratches in the wood, barely visible unless you knew where to look. They started about halfway up the door and curved downward, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at it from the inside, desperate to escape. Sarah could almost see it in her mind's eye, fingernails breaking against the wood, splitting and bleeding as they dug deeper and deeper, driven by a terror she couldn't begin to comprehend. She shuddered and retreated to the kitchen, but the image stayed with her, burning itself into her thoughts. That night the cold was worse than ever. It seemed to have a weight to it, a presence that went beyond mere temperature. Even in their bedroom, supposedly the warmest room in the apartment, Sarah could feel it seeping in from the hallway, like something alive and malevolent crawling through the air itself. Jack noticed it too, which was somehow more frightening than any of the strange occurrences she'd experienced alone. It meant she wasn't imagining things, wasn't just letting an overactive imagination run wild in a new place. "You feel that?" he asked, pulling the blankets up to his chin like a child trying to hide from monsters. "It's like we're in the middle of a blizzard." His voice had a forced casualness to it, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension, the same unease that had been growing in her since they moved in. She nodded, trying to keep her voice steady as she suggested, "Maybe we should ask the landlord about the heating." It was a pathetically inadequate response to what they were experiencing, but it was safer than acknowledging the alternative, that something was fundamentally wrong with their apartment, something that went beyond faulty heating systems and old pipes. Jack agreed, but like so many things that frighten us, they never got around to it. Life has a way of pushing the supernatural to the background, filling their days with deadlines and meetings and the 1,000 small tasks that make up normal existence. Still, the chill lingered, and that tapping sound became a regular feature of Sarah's nights, always faint, always emanating from the back room, always following that same pattern. 3 quick, 2 slow. Then came the day that changed everything. Sarah came home early from work, having begged off with a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The apartment was quiet in that peculiar way that suggests it's not really empty at all. The shadows from the late afternoon sun stretched across the walls like grasping fingers, and the air felt thick with anticipation. She went into the kitchen, driven by habit more than hunger, and there it was, a half-eaten sandwich on the counter, the bread slightly stale, the edges of the meat curling as if it had been sitting there for hours. She stopped dead, staring at it as if it might suddenly sprout legs and scuttle away. Jack was working late that day. She'd just texted with him about it, and she hadn't made any food since breakfast. As she leaned closer, a sharp, musty odor hit her, a smell that didn't belong in any living space, rotting wood and damp earth, with an underlying sweetness that reminded her horrifyingly of decomposition. It was the smell of old graves and forgotten spaces, of things that should have been left undisturbed. Sarah backed out of the kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The rational part of her mind tried desperately to construct explanations. Maybe she had made the sandwich and forgotten. Maybe Jack had come home for lunch. Maybe a neighbor had somehow gotten in. But deep down, she knew none of those explanations fit. Something was living in their apartment, something that ate and moved and watched them when they weren't looking. When Jack got home, she told him about the sandwich, watching his face carefully as the words spilled out. He looked at her with a mixture of concern and skepticism that made her stomach twist. "You're sure you didn't make it?" he asked, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe during lunch." "Of course I didn't," she snapped, the fear making her voice sharp. "I know what I did and didn't do today, Jack." He rubbed his temples, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his response to stress. "Maybe you just forgot. You've been working a lot lately, under a lot of pressure with that new manuscript." His voice trailed off as he saw the expression on her face. Sarah wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that she was just stressed, just forgetting things, just letting an old building and an overactive imagination get the better of her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in that apartment, that something was watching them, waiting for what? That night, as they lay in bed pretending to sleep, she heard it. A whisper, so faint she might have missed it if she hadn't been lying there straining her ears for any unusual sound. It was a woman's voice, soft and desperate, coming from the direction of the back room. "Please, let me out." Sarah shot up in bed, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. Jack was still sleeping beside her, his breathing deep and regular. She grabbed his shoulder, shaking him perhaps harder than necessary. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He groaned, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Hear what?" "There's someone in the back room," she said, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I heard a woman's voice." That got his attention. He sat up, suddenly alert, reaching for the baseball bat he'd started keeping beside the bed. Sarah hadn't commented when he'd first placed it there, understanding instinctively that he too had been feeling the wrongness of their home. He moved toward the back room with the cautious grace of someone expecting trouble, motioning for her to stay behind. She watched from the doorway of their bedroom as he slowly pushed open the door to the back room, his knuckles white around the bat's handle. The room was empty, of course, just the cold, silent darkness and that damned attic door, still locked tight when he rattled the handle. But something had changed in the atmosphere, as if their acknowledgement of the strange events had given them more power. "Nobody's here," he whispered, but his voice shook slightly, betraying his unease. They went back to bed, but sleep was impossible. Sarah lay there listening to the silence, feeling the cold creep closer, knowing that something was waiting just beyond the walls, watching and waiting with infinite patience. The next morning, she called the landlord. Mr. Peterson sounded distracted as ever, barely engaging as she described the strange noises, the persistent cold, the feeling of being watched. But when she mentioned the attic door, his entire demeanor changed. "You said the attic door was locked, right?" he asked sharply, suddenly paying very close attention. "Yes," she replied, caught off guard by his shift in tone. "Why?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his breathing and what might have been paper shuffling. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been guilt. "There was a tenant before you moved in. Young woman, about your age. She had some issues. Started saying strange things about the apartment. Said the walls were closing in on her, that something was trapping her. We thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Then one day she just disappeared. We never found her, just her things, like she'd vanished into thin air." Sarah's mouth went dry as cotton. "Did you report her missing?" He hesitated again, longer this time. "Yes, but the police didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. They thought maybe she just left, had some kind of episode and took off. But some of her things are still in the attic. I thought it was best to just lock it up, you know? Out of sight, out of mind." She hung up, her mind reeling with implications. The landlord's words echoed in her head. She thought something was trapping her. That night, Sarah reached her breaking point. She waited until Jack was asleep, his soft snores providing a counterpoint to the ever-present tapping from the walls. She crept out of bed, armed with a screwdriver she'd taken from Jack's toolbox, and made her way to the back room. The attic door seemed to loom larger in the darkness, its outline barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the street. She knelt before it, her hands shaking as she worked at the lock. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, it finally gave way with a soft click that seemed deafening in the midnight quiet. She pushed the door up slowly, grimacing at the wave of stale, musty air that rushed out. The attic space was cramped and dark, filled with the expected detritus of abandoned lives. Old boxes, dust-covered furniture, forgotten memories. But in the center of it all, half buried in decades of dust, was a small notebook. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, its cover worn and water-stained. Inside, the handwriting started out neat and controlled, but gradually deteriorated, becoming more frantic and uneven with each entry. The words themselves told a story of descending madness, or perhaps terrible clarity. "I can't breathe. They won't let me out. They're watching me always, waiting. The walls aren't what they seem. They're hungry." The entries grew more desperate, each page more unhinged than the last, the writer's grip on reality seemingly slipping away with each word. And on the final page, scratched so deeply into the paper that it had nearly torn through, was a single word: help. Sarah dropped the notebook as if it had burned her, scrambling backward. The cold intensified, becoming almost solid in its presence, and suddenly the tapping was everywhere, not just from the walls, but from above, below, all around her, growing louder and more insistent with each second. She ran from the attic, slamming the door shut with enough force to rattle the walls. She flew to the bedroom, shaking Jack awake with frantic urgency. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Now." Something in her face must have convinced him. Perhaps he saw in her eyes the same terror that had been scratched into that notebook's pages. Without a word, he grabbed some essential items, and they left that apartment behind, not even bothering to close the door behind them. The next day, Sarah called Mr. Peterson and told him they were moving out. He didn't ask for an explanation, and she didn't offer one. As they drove away from that building for the last time, she felt the cold slowly recede, the sense of dread fading like a bad dream in morning light. But sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the world is quiet and still, Sarah thinks she hears that faint tapping. And she can't help but wonder if the previous tenant is still there, trapped in those hungry walls, waiting for someone to finally let her out. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, if she's become part of whatever lives within them, helping to lure the next tenants into that cold, watching darkness. Sarah tries not to think about what might have happened if they'd stayed just one more night. If they'd ignored the signs for too long, like she did. Some apartments come with history, they say, but some come with hunger, and the rent is far higher than anyone should be willing to pay. She bought the cabin on the edge of Whispering Pines Forest, sight unseen. It was a steal for a property that size. 3 bedrooms, a wide wraparound porch, and a view that stretched over acres of untouched Maine wilderness. For her and her husband Alex, it was a dream come true. An escape from the suffocating urban sprawl of Boston. A place for their son, Sam, to grow up close to nature. The listing photos had shown a rustic charm that spoke to something deep within them. A yearning for simplicity they hadn't even realized they'd been harboring in their concrete jungle existence. The real estate agent had seemed almost too eager to close the deal, rushing through paperwork with an urgency that should have raised red flags. But they were too enchanted by the promise of their new life to notice the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the property's history, or how she avoided making eye contact when discussing the previous owner's hasty departure. "Family emergency," she'd said dismissively, shuffling papers with manicured hands that couldn't quite hide their shaking. They arrived on a crisp October morning, the sky overcast, a light drizzle misting the car windows as they wound up the narrow dirt road to the cabin. The drive had been longer than expected, each mile taking them further from civilization, from the comfort of streetlights and neighbors' houses. Cell service had disappeared an hour ago, leaving them guided only by increasingly weathered road signs and their realtor's hastily sketched map. Whispering Pines was everything they'd hoped for and more. Dense trees stretched high above them, their leaves a dark, muted green that blocked out much of the sunlight. The cabin itself was secluded, barely visible from the road, surrounded by a thicket of tall pines and a low fog that clung to the forest floor like a burial shroud. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. As Alex struggled with their luggage, she noticed how the sound of his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing any noise they made, hungry for their presence. "Look, Mom, I can see our whole backyard," Sam shouted excitedly as he ran to the edge of the porch, gazing into the woods. She smiled, glad to see him so excited, but something about his words unsettled her. The woods were different. There was a stillness to them, a strange, pervasive silence that wasn't like the calm quiet she'd expected. It was almost as if the forest was waiting, holding its breath. The trees stood unnaturally still, their branches reaching toward the cabin like gnarled fingers, frozen in mid-grasp. That first night, as they settled into bed, she was jolted awake by the sound of branches scratching against the window. It was a gentle, almost rhythmic sound, like something tapping, testing, feeling its way. The moonlight cast strange shadows on their bedroom wall, shapes that seemed to move and twist when viewed from the corner of her eye. She nudged Alex, but he only muttered something about the wind and rolled over, his breathing already deep and regular. The scratching continued, growing more insistent, more deliberate. It reminded her of fingernails on glass, searching for a way in. Eventually, she convinced herself it was just a tree branch swaying in the breeze and forced herself back to sleep, but her dreams were filled with whispered voices and the sound of wood scraping against wood. The following day dawned gray and cold, the fog still clinging to the trees like spectral fingers. Sam spent most of his time exploring, darting in and out of the trees near the edge of the yard. She watched him from the kitchen window, laughing as he found sticks, rocks, and leaves to add to his growing collection. But there was something off about the way he moved, something different in his usual playful manner. He seemed to be following a pattern, stopping at specific trees, looking up into their branches as if listening to something she couldn't hear. When he came back in for lunch, his cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. He was holding something she hadn't seen before. A small wooden doll, carved crudely but unmistakably in the shape of a boy, with small black stones for eyes. The stones caught the light strangely, seeming to follow her movements as she approached. "Where did you find that?" she asked, feeling a prickling unease as she took the doll from him. The wood was smooth, worn as if it had been handled countless times, and surprisingly warm to the touch. "Just by the big tree over there," he replied, pointing into the woods. "There's more of them, too. They leave them for me to find." Her breath caught at his words. "They?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who's they, sweetie?" But Sam just shrugged, already distracted by his sandwich, leaving her to stare at the doll in her hands. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. It was too detailed, too deliberate for something left out in the woods. The face was carved with an unsettling precision, its features almost familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. It was as if it had been waiting for him to find it, placed there with purpose and intent. That night, as she and Alex lay in bed, she heard the scratching sound again, louder this time, scraping insistently against the glass. Her heart pounded as she sat up, trying to peer into the darkness outside. But all she could see was the reflection of their room in the glass, distorted and strange. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. In that silence, she could have sworn she heard something else, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like wooden joints moving in the dark. The next morning, she went out to inspect the area around the cabin, hoping to find a broken branch or something to explain the noise. The ground was soft from the constant drizzle, perfect for leaving tracks, but there was nothing. No sign of branches touching the house. No footprints or animal tracks. The silence of the forest felt heavier, more intense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the morning light, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Over the next few days, Sam found more dolls, each one carved to look more detailed, more specific. One had tufts of what looked like animal fur glued to its head. Another had tiny twigs arranged around it like a crown. But the last one was the most disturbing. It was taller, more slender, its features more human, and it wore a dark, twisted expression carved deeply into its wooden face. The black stone eyes seemed to follow her around the room, and sometimes late at night, she could have sworn she heard it moving. Tiny wooden limbs scratching against the shelf where Sam had placed it. She tried asking him where he kept finding them, but he would only shrug, muttering something about the Watchers. He said it casually, like he was describing squirrels or birds, but there was something different about his eyes now, a distance that hadn't been there before. When she pressed him, he looked at her with those wide, innocent eyes and said, "They're nice, Mom. They watch over us so we don't get lost. They've been here forever, waiting for someone to play with." Something inside her twisted at those words. She didn't want to believe it, but a part of her couldn't deny the unease that was growing stronger each day. Whispering Pines didn't feel like their retreat anymore. It felt like a trap. The forest seemed to press closer each night, the trees inching toward the cabin when they weren't looking, their branches reaching for their windows like desperate hands. On the fifth night, she woke up to find Sam standing at the foot of their bed, his small face pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide and empty. He was completely still, like one of the dolls come to life, and in his hands, he clutched something that made her blood run cold, another wooden figure, this one freshly carved, the wood still damp with sap. "Sam?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. His skin was ice cold. "What are you doing up?" "They're outside," he murmured, his voice flat and distant, like he was speaking from very far away. "They want to come in. They say it's time." Her blood turned to ice. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see faces pressed against the glass, but there was only darkness, a darkness that seemed to move and shift, filled with shapes just beyond recognition. She scooped Sam up, carrying him back to his room and tucking him in, her heart racing as she whispered to him that everything would be okay. But even as she said it, she felt the weight of the lie. Sam's eyes remained fixed on the window, watching something she couldn't see, and his grip on the wooden doll never loosened. The next morning, they found another doll sitting on the porch, its carved face smiling up at them. This one was unmistakable. It looked exactly like Sam, down to the small birthmark on his cheek and the tattered shirt he'd worn the day before. The craftsmanship was perfect, too perfect, as if someone had been studying him closely, memorizing every detail of his appearance. The black stone eyes seemed to hold a gleam of intelligence, of hunger. Alex picked it up, turning it over in his hands with a look of confusion and growing horror. This isn't right," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "Who's doing this? Who could have gotten this close to him?" She shook her head, unable to answer. All she could think of was the scratching at the window, the whispering in the woods, the way the trees seemed to close in around them, each one a silent, watchful figure. The forest had changed since they arrived, or perhaps it had always been this way, and they were only now beginning to see it for what it really was. That night they heard footsteps. Not scratching, not tapping, but heavy, deliberate footsteps moving around the cabin, stopping just outside each window. They sounded wrong somehow, too rigid, too mechanical, like something trying to imitate human movement without quite getting it right. They lay in bed, listening as the steps moved from one side of the house to the other, slow and methodical. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, they stopped. A silence fell over the cabin, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the soft sound of wood creaking in the dark. In the morning, the dolls were gone. Every single one that Sam had found was missing, vanished without a trace. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Sam's face was pale, his eyes haunted as he stood at the edge of the porch, staring into the trees. The forest seemed different now, more alive somehow, the branches swaying despite the still air. "They're mad," he whispered, barely loud enough for her to hear. "They don't like when you take them." "Who doesn't like it, Sam?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady as she watched shadows move between the trees, tall and angular, almost human but not quite. "The Watchers," he replied simply, his gaze never leaving the forest. "They don't like when you take their gifts. They say we have to stay now. They've chosen us." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a faint whispering sound, like voices just beyond hearing, speaking in a language made of creaking wood and rustling leaves. She pulled Sam close, her heart pounding as she stared into the dense shadows of the forest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking out there, something old and angry, something that had been here long before them and would remain long after they were gone. That night, they packed their bags, barely able to wait for dawn. But as they loaded the car, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the woods, a tall, slender figure standing among the trees, its face hidden in shadow, watching them with an intensity that felt almost human. Its body seemed wrong, too angular, too stiff, like a puppet made of branches and twigs. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as it raised one long, twisted arm, pointing directly at her. Behind it, other shapes emerged from the shadows, each one a grotesque parody of human form, their wooden limbs moving with unnatural grace. "Mom." Sam's voice broke the silence, and she turned to find him staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. But there was something else in his expression now, something that made her blood run cold. A look of recognition, of understanding. She forced a smile, ushering him into the car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. As they drove away, she glanced back at the cabin, at the shadowed figures standing among the trees, watching them go. They stood perfectly still, their wooden bodies creaking softly in the morning breeze, their black stone eyes reflecting the pale light. And as the forest swallowed the cabin from view, she felt a strange, sinking dread settle in her chest, a feeling that they hadn't escaped at all, that the Watchers would follow them, that they would find them wherever they went. That night, in their hotel room 50 miles away, she found a small wooden doll sitting on the nightstand, its carved face an exact replica of her own, its black stone eyes gleaming in the darkness. And somewhere deep in the forest of whispering pines, just beyond the edge of sight, the Watchers waited, their wooden faces carved in twisted smiles, their black stone eyes glinting in the fading light, patient and eternal, knowing that sooner or later they would return. After all, they were chosen, and the Watchers of Whispering Pines never let go of what they claimed as their own. It was supposed to be a straightforward job: document the contents of the old Victorian mansion, catalog anything of historical value, and move on to the next assignment, just like every other job I'd done in the last decade as an appraiser. But Hollowmoor Hall wasn't like any other estate I'd been assigned to. The mansion stood on the outskirts of Northwood, Maine, looming over the small town like a graying corpse on the hill. Its tall, imposing structure was half hidden by dense, overgrown shrubs, broken-down stone gates, and an eerie silence. The morning fog clung to the property like a burial shroud, refusing to dissipate even as the weak autumn sun climbed higher in the sky. Dead leaves skittered across the cracked pathway leading to the front door, dancing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if moved by unseen hands. It was as though time had forgotten this place, and in return, the mansion had chosen to forget time. I thought I was prepared for anything, but Hollowmoor Hall had other plans. The mansion stood on the outskirts of Northwood, Maine, looming over the small town like a graying corpse on the hill. Its tall, imposing structure was half hidden by dense, overgrown shrubs, broken-down stone gates, and an eerie silence. The morning fog clung to the property like a burial shroud, refusing to dissipate even as the weak autumn sun climbed higher in the sky. Dead leaves skittered across the cracked pathway leading to the front door, dancing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if moved by unseen hands. It was as though time had forgotten this place, and in return, the mansion had chosen to forget time. I thought I was prepared for anything, but Hollowmoor Hall had other plans. I'd arrived later than intended, having gotten lost twice on the winding back roads leading to the property. The GPS had failed mysteriously as I approached, the screen flickering before going dark entirely. I'd had to rely on the crude hand-drawn map the estate agent had provided, which seemed to shift and change each time I looked at it. When I finally pulled up to the iron gates, my usual professional confidence had already begun to waver. The locals in town hadn't helped matters. When I'd stopped at the small diner for directions, the elderly waitress had turned pale at the mention of Hollowmoor Hall. She'd crossed herself quickly, mumbling something about the children before hurrying away. The other patrons had suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating, avoiding my gaze entirely. Only a weathered old man at the counter had spoken up, warning me that some places were better left undisturbed. I'd dismissed their reactions as small-town superstition, but now, standing before the mansion, Their fear seemed far more reasonable. The moment I crossed the threshold, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, thick and cloying, pressing down on my shoulders as if the house itself resented my presence. The floorboards beneath my feet seemed to exhale as I stepped inside, releasing decades of stale air that carried with it the musty scent of decay and something else. Something metallic and sharp that reminded me of old pennies. My colleague, Jess, a young appraiser and historian with a knack for unraveling old stories, had arrived half an hour before me. She was standing in the grand foyer, her flashlight sweeping over the dusty floorboards, illuminating cobwebs that stretched across the cracked walls like abandoned spiderwebs in a forgotten tomb. Her usually bright demeanor seemed subdued, her movements careful and measured, as if she was trying not to disturb something that slumbered just beyond our sight. "Can you believe this place?" she whispered as I joined her, her voice muffled and quiet, as though she was afraid of disturbing something sleeping within the walls. Her gaze flicked up to the sweeping, dark staircase that led into deeper shadows above. The ornate banister was carved with intricate patterns, faces and figures that seemed to writhe and twist in the beam of her flashlight. "It's eerie, all right," I replied, shivering involuntarily. "But the quicker we get through this, the sooner we're out." My words hung in the air like frost, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was listening, absorbing our conversation with malevolent interest. Together we moved through the main floor, cataloging old furniture, paintings, and strange little trinkets tucked away in dusty corners. Each room seemed to hold its own particular breed of darkness, despite the wan sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The portraits that lined the walls followed our movements with painted eyes that appeared too liquid, too alive. I caught myself avoiding their gaze, turning away whenever I felt their stares boring into my back. The drawing room was particularly unsettling. A grand piano stood in one corner, its ivory keys yellowed with age. As we passed by, a single note rang out, clear and sharp in the silence. Jess and I both jumped, spinning to face the instrument. "Must be settling," I muttered, though we both knew that wasn't true. The sound had been deliberate, purposeful, like a finger pressing down on a specific key. In the hallway, we found a stack of journals, tucked carefully into a rotting bookcase that leaned dangerously to one side. The leather bindings were cracked and peeling, but the brass clasps still gleamed as if they'd been recently polished. Jess flipped through them, her eyes narrowing with interest, the pages crackling like dead leaves under her careful touch. "They're all family journals," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold air. "And not just normal diary entries. These read like confessions." She showed me one, open to a passage where someone named Albert Hollowmore described hearing footsteps echoing through the empty hallways at night. Heavy, deliberate, and always stopping just outside his bedroom door. The ink had bled through the pages in places, creating dark constellations that seemed to form faces when viewed from certain angles. As Jess read further, her voice grew more troubled. "There's something here about a series of disappearances in the 1890s. Children from the town below. The last entry suggests that Albert's wife, Margaret, knew something about it, but..." She trailed off, turning the page. The rest is illegible, just frantic scribbling. "Spooky," I chuckled nervously, trying to keep my tone light. But there was something unsettling about the words, about the desperation in the handwriting, each line carved onto the paper as though the writer had been pressing down with a shaking hand. My voice echoed oddly in the empty space, bouncing back to me with a strange, distorted quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It sounded wrong somehow, as if someone, or something, had caught my words and twisted them before throwing them back. The dining room proved to be another exercise in restraining our growing unease. The massive table still bore place settings for 12, the silver tarnished but intact. Each chair was pulled out slightly, as if the occupants had just stepped away for a moment. But it was the stains on the tablecloth that caught my attention. Dark splotches that might have been wine, except for their distribution. They formed a pattern that looked disturbingly like a child's handprint. As we worked our way through the house, I began to notice subtle changes in Jess's behavior. Her usual methodical approach to documentation became almost obsessive. She would spend long minutes staring at seemingly ordinary objects. A tarnished silver brush, a child's porcelain doll, a music box with its mechanism long since rusted shut. Her fingers would trace their edges with an almost reverent touch, and sometimes I could hear her whispering under her breath, though I couldn't make out the words. The children's nursery on the second floor stopped us both in our tracks. The room was frozen in time, toys scattered across the floor as if their owners had just left for dinner. A rocking horse swayed gently, though there wasn't a breath of wind. On the wall, a mural depicted scenes from fairy tales, but the paint had warped and peeled in places, transforming the cheerful images into something grotesque. The faces of the painted children seemed to follow us as we moved through the room, their expressions shifting from innocent to pleading when viewed from different angles. We continued working through the rooms, though the deeper we went, the harder it was to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation was like a physical weight, a pressure that seemed to increase with each passing hour. Every so often I would turn to Jess to see if she felt it too, but she was too engrossed in her work, her eyes glazed as she examined the artifacts, her fingers tracing the edges of each item like she was hypnotized. The library proved particularly challenging. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes whose titles had long since faded into illegibility. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and leather, but underneath lurked that same metallic tang I'd noticed at the entrance. As we worked, I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from between the stacks, snippets of conversations and voices that sounded almost, but not quite, human. One book caught my attention, a leather-bound volume with no title, just a strange symbol embossed on its spine. When I pulled it from the shelf, a photograph fluttered to the floor. It showed a group of children standing in front of Hollowmore Hall, their faces blurred as if they'd all moved at the exact moment the picture was taken. Behind them, in an upper window, a figure stood watching. The photograph was dated 1891, just before the disappearances Jess had mentioned. It was getting late, and we decided to tackle the basement next, though everything in me screamed to leave it for another day. The entrance was down a narrow hallway near the kitchen, where an old wooden door hung slightly ajar, its hinges groaning as I pushed it open. The sound it made was almost like a warning, a long, low moan that seemed to carry echoes of past terrors. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we descended, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. Our flashlight beams caught motes of dust that danced in the air like silent snowfall. But they moved wrong, sometimes against the air currents, sometimes forming patterns that looked almost like letters before dispersing. Behind us, I heard the door at the top of the stairs slam shut with a finality that made my heart skip. At the bottom, the smell hit us, a foul, damp odor like mold mixed with something rotten. It was the smell of old death and older secrets, of things buried but not forgotten. Jess wrinkled her nose, pulling her scarf up over her mouth and nose as she switched on her flashlight. The beam seemed weaker down here, as if the darkness was actively fighting against it. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered, shivering as we moved into the basement's depths. But even as I spoke, I knew that our work at Hollowmore Hall was far from over. The house had been waiting for us, and now that we were here, it had no intention of letting us go easily. Our flashlights revealed rows of old shelving units, their contents hidden beneath sheets that had long since turned gray with age. Water stains marked the concrete walls in patterns that looked disturbingly like faces in pain. and in the corners, shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending far beyond what the house's foundations should have allowed. In the furthest corner we found a door. It was small, more like a cabinet than a proper entrance, and sealed with heavy iron bands. The metal was pristine, showing no signs of rust despite the dampness. As we approached, the air grew thick with an electromagnetic charge that made my skin crawl. Our flashlight beams began to flicker and dance, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And then we heard it, a sound that stopped us both in our tracks. From behind that door came a soft, sweet sound, like children singing a nursery rhyme. The melody was familiar but wrong somehow, the words twisted and garbled. As we stood there, frozen, a small handprint appeared in the dust on the door's surface, as if pressed from the other side. As we stared at the small handprint fading in the dust, a cold draft whispered through the basement, carrying with it the distant sound of children's laughter. But there was something wrong about it, a hollow, echoing quality that made it sound less like joy and more like mockery. Jess took a step toward the door, her hand outstretched. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. "Don't," I warned, but her eyes had taken on that glazed look again. She was mumbling something under her breath, words I couldn't quite catch but that made my teeth ache when I tried to listen too closely. "They're just children," she whispered, her voice oddly distant. "They've been waiting so long. They just want someone to play with them." Her free hand was still reaching for the door, fingers trembling in the flickering beam of our flashlights. "Jess, those aren't children anymore," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Whatever's behind that door, it just wants us to think they are." The singing had grown louder, more distinct. I could almost make out the words now, though I knew I didn't want to. The melody was familiar. "Ring around the rosy," but the lyrics were wrong, twisted into something that made my stomach turn. A sharp crack echoed through the basement as one of the iron bands on the door shifted, the metal groaning as if under immense pressure. The temperature dropped so suddenly that our breath came out in thick white clouds. The flashlight beams dimmed further, barely penetrating the darkness that seemed to pulse around us like a living thing. That's when I noticed the water stains on the walls were changing. What I had taken for random patterns were forming into distinct scenes. Children playing, dancing in a circle, but their faces were wrong, distorted into expressions no child should ever wear. The images seemed to move in the corner of my eye, but whenever I looked directly at them, they froze. "We need to leave," I said, pulling harder on Jess's arm. "Now." But Jess wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the door, which had begun to vibrate slightly. A thin line of what looked like black liquid was seeping out from underneath it, spreading across the floor in patterns that resembled childish drawings. "They're showing me," she whispered, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. "They're showing me what happened, what she did to them, what's in the walls, in the foundations, why the house feels so heavy." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were different, darker, with pinprick pupils that seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. "Margaret Hollowmore didn't just take them. She made them part of the house. She bound them here, forever." The singing had reached a fever pitch now, multiple children's voices overlapping in a cacophony of twisted nursery rhymes. The black liquid was spreading faster, and where it touched the walls, new images formed. Terrible scenes of ritual and sacrifice, of a desperate woman trying to grant herself immortality through the most unspeakable means. I fumbled in my pocket for the heavy iron key the estate agent had given me, the one that was supposed to open any door in the house. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to press it into Jess's palm. The metal was ice cold, and as soon as it touched her skin, she gasped as if waking from a dream. "Run," I said. and this time she didn't resist. We fled up the basement stairs, the sounds of children's laughter echoing behind us, mixed with something else now, a deeper sound, like the house itself was laughing. The door at the top of the stairs had locked itself, but the key worked, though it took both of us pushing against the wood to force it open. As we burst into the kitchen, the entire house seemed to shudder. Pictures flew off walls, furniture toppled, and that terrible laughing sound grew louder. We ran for the front door, dodging falling debris and trying to ignore the way the floor seemed to ripple beneath our feet, as if something massive was moving under the floorboards. The front door was stuck. No amount of pulling or pushing would make it budge. Through the windows, we could see that the fog had grown thicker, pressing against the glass like a living thing. And in that fog, shapes moved. Small, child-sized figures that danced and twirled, their forms becoming more solid as they got closer to the house. Jess was crying now, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. "I can still hear them," she sobbed. "They're in my head. They want us to stay. They want us to play with them. Forever." The key. It had worked on the basement door. Maybe it would work here too. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit it into the lock. But finally I heard the mechanism click. The door swung open with such force it nearly knocked us both down. We ran. Through the fog, down the overgrown path, past the broken gates. We didn't stop running until we reached my car, and even then, we didn't look back until we were several miles down the road. Later, when we tried to explain to the estate agent why we couldn't complete the appraisal, words failed us. How could we describe what we had experienced? How could we explain about the door in the basement, the singing, the black liquid that formed impossible patterns? How could we tell him about the children who weren't children anymore? About the terrible secret Margaret Hollowmore had left buried in the foundations of her house? In the end, we simply said the house was unsafe, structurally unsound. Let someone else discover its secrets. Let someone else hear the singing. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those twisted nursery rhymes. And Jess was never quite the same. She left the appraisal business shortly after, moved away without leaving a forwarding address. The last time I saw her, she was humming something under her breath. A familiar tune, but with words that made no sense. And her eyes had that same distant look they'd had in the basement, as if she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. As for Hollowmore Hall, it still stands on its hill, looking down on the town below. Sometimes people say they see lights in the windows at night, or hear the sound of children playing, but no one goes near it anymore. The estate agent never found another appraiser willing to take the job. Some places are better left undisturbed. Some secrets are better left buried. And some houses are never empty, no matter how long they've stood abandoned. The old man in the diner had been right after all. We thought we were doing the right thing. 10 years since it happened, and it seemed like the right time to go back. Like somehow going back to Cedar Creek would make everything right, or at least help us feel like we hadn't abandoned him there. The weight of that decade hung heavy over us, each year adding another layer of guilt to our collective conscience. We'd made a pact back then, sworn to never speak of what really happened that night. But secrets have a way of festering, of growing until they become too heavy to bear. But from the moment we arrived, everything felt off. The air itself seemed different, thicker somehow, as though the very atmosphere was trying to warn us away. The gravel driveway crunched ominously under our tires, each stone seeming to whisper secrets we'd rather forget. We all noticed it in our own way. Sam, with his constant glances toward the tree line, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Every rustle of leaves made him jump, as though he expected something to emerge from the dense forest that surrounded the lodge. Neil, nervously flicking his lighter over and over again, the metallic click, click, click marking time like a twisted metronome. His hands shook slightly each time he tried to light a cigarette, though he'd quit smoking years ago. And Claire, normally the life of the party, uncharacteristically quiet, her eyes fixed on the lodge. She'd always been the strongest of us, the one who held us together after Tom's disappearance. But now she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the looming presence of Cedar Creek. Nothing about Cedar Creek Lodge had changed. The same wide porch, weathered by countless storms, its boards groaning under our feet like the complaints of an old man. The same peeling paint, revealing layers of history beneath, first white, then blue, then a sickly yellow, as though the building itself was decomposing. Even the rusty lantern still hanging from the rafters, swaying slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel. It was as though the past 10 years had passed it by, leaving it frozen in time, preserved like a fly in amber. "Feels like we never left," Sam muttered, echoing my thoughts. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I saw him swallow hard, fighting back whatever memories were threatening to surface. We went inside, our footsteps creaking over the worn floorboards. Each step felt like an intrusion, as though we were walking across someone's grave. The lodge was untouched, a time capsule of that fatal summer. Dust lay in thick layers over the furniture, but otherwise it looked exactly as it had that last night, as though someone, or something, had been keeping everything just the way we'd left it. The magazines on the coffee table were still open to the same pages, the dishes in the sink still waited to be washed, and Tom's favorite mug still sat on the counter, a decade-old coffee stain marking its interior. I tried to shake the feeling, the creeping sensation that we were being watched by unseen eyes. We were here to honor Tom, after all, not to be spooked by a cabin. That last summer, he'd been the one who convinced us to come. "One more summer," he'd said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Just us." His words had carried a weight none of us understood at the time, as though he'd known something we didn't. And then he'd drowned. It was supposed to be a night swim, something we'd done 100 times before. The lake had always been our playground, our sanctuary. But somehow, in the pitch-black water, he'd disappeared beneath the surface, and we never saw him again. At least, that's what we told ourselves, what we told the police, what we've been telling ourselves for 10 years. That memory haunted us, but none of us wanted to admit it, not out loud. The truth was too terrible, too heavy with implications we couldn't face. That's why I think we all agreed to come back, as if reliving it could somehow bring him back, or at least give us the courage to face what really happened that night. It was dark by the time we got settled, the sun setting with an almost unnatural speed behind the mountains. Neil lit the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The flames reflected in the windows, making it impossible to see outside, turning the glass into dark mirrors that seemed to hold shapes just at the edge of vision. We ate in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the only sounds the scraping of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the fireplace. And then, just as the quiet began to feel unbearable, Claire spoke up. Did you guys ever wonder if he's still here?" Her voice trembled slightly, breaking the silence like a stone through ice. We all stared at her. Her voice was small, hesitant, as though she were afraid to even say it. But there was something else in her tone, something that suggested she already knew the answer. "He's gone, Claire," Neil said, his voice flat, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his lighter again. Click, click, click. "I know," she replied, her gaze fixed on the fire, watching the flames dance. "But sometimes I think, we never really got closure. It feels like he's just waiting for us to come back, waiting for us to tell the truth." The room fell silent again, her words hanging in the air like a fog. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, I'd felt the same thing. That maybe Tom had never really left Cedar Creek. That maybe he couldn't leave, not until we faced what we'd done. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The lodge was silent, but not in the way you'd expect from an empty building. It was a thick, pressing silence, as though something were holding its breath just out of sight. The darkness seemed alive somehow, pulsing with unspoken accusations. The moonlight filtering through the window cast strange shadows on the wall, shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just one of the others, up for a late-night trip to the bathroom. But as I lay there, listening, I realized the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They moved from one end of the hall to the other, stopping outside each door, as though whatever was making them was checking on us, making sure we were still there. The floorboards creaked under the weight, but it was different from when we walked on them. These creaks seemed purposeful, almost like words in a language I couldn't quite understand, including mine. I held my breath, staring at the sliver of light under the door, waiting for the shadow of feet to appear. But the light remained clear, undisturbed, and somehow that was worse, because it meant whatever was out there wasn't casting a shadow. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? The night stretched on endlessly, filled with small sounds that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, fragments of conversations from 10 years ago, echoes of laughter that turned to screams. In the morning, over stale coffee and toast, I mentioned the footsteps. The words felt heavy in my mouth, as though speaking them aloud made them more real. "You heard them too?" Claire asked, her eyes wide, dark circles beneath them suggesting she hadn't slept either. I nodded, and Neil groaned, rubbing his temples. "It's an old building. Creaky floors. What did you expect?" But his voice lacked conviction, and his hand still shook as he reached for the coffee pot. But Sam looked shaken, more than any of us. "It wasn't just the floors, man. I swear I heard someone crying, like a muffled sound, coming from the basement." He paused, swallowing hard. It sounded like Tom, like he did that night when we all froze. No one spoke, but I could see it in their eyes. They'd heard it too. The same desperate sobs that had echoed across the lake that night, before the water swallowed them forever. Or at least, we'd thought it was forever. We tried to brush it off, going about our day as if nothing had happened. We even ventured down to the lake, standing at the edge of the water, staring at the spot where Tom had disappeared. The lake was mirror smooth, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. But none of us wanted to swim. Not after what we'd heard. Not when we knew what lay beneath those dark waters. By the time we got back to the lodge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. And that's when we saw it, the front door, slightly open. We hadn't left it like that. We'd made sure to close it, all of us double-checking because none of us wanted to think about what might get in otherwise. "Maybe it's the wind," Neil muttered, but his voice was shaky, and the air was perfectly still. We went inside, all of us tense, and found nothing. No sign of anyone else. Just the same thick layer of dust, the same quiet, and the same oppressive cold that seemed to seep from the walls. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. On the table in the center of the room was a photograph, one I hadn't seen before, though I knew immediately when it had been taken. It was a picture of the 5 of us from that last summer, standing by the lake. But something was wrong. In the photo, Tom was smiling, his arm around Claire, but his eyes were staring directly at me. They looked hollow, almost pleading, and behind us in the water, there was a dark shape, something rising from the depths that hadn't been there when the picture was taken. Something with too many angles, too many shadows. I tried to laugh it off, to say it was just my imagination, but I could see the same fear in Claire's face, in Sam's uneasy glances. We all recognized that shape, though none of us would say it aloud. "All right, enough," Neil snapped, grabbing the photo and stuffing it into his bag. "We're just freaking ourselves out. There's nothing here, okay? Nothing." But his voice cracked on the last word, and we all heard what he wasn't saying. Nothing except what we brought with us. Nothing except the truth we'd been running from for 10 years. We all nodded, trying to convince ourselves. But that night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tom was watching us, waiting. Not for revenge, perhaps, but for acknowledgement, for confession. The footsteps returned, heavier this time, as though something were pacing just outside my door. And then the whispering started, faint but unmistakable. A voice, soft and desperate, calling my name. "Tell them," it seemed to say. "Tell them what really happened." I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blankets, telling myself it was just a dream. But the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The voice was Tom's, but not Tom's. Distorted, as though speaking through water, through time, through death itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there, frozen, listening to the silence. And then, as if in a nightmare, I heard the door to the back bedroom creak open. A scream cut through the night. Claire's voice, high and terrified. I leapt out of bed, running down the hall, the others right behind me. Claire was standing in the doorway, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with fear. He's in there," she stammered, pointing at the bed. Water dripped from her fingertip, though she hadn't been near the lake. We all crowded into the room, staring at the empty bed, the rumpled sheets. But they weren't just rumpled. They were wet, soaking wet. And in the center of the bed was a perfect impression of a body, as though someone had just been lying there. "There's no one here, Claire," Neil said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But we all saw his hands shaking, saw the way he couldn't take his eyes off the wet sheets. "But I saw him," she insisted. I saw Tom. He was lying right there, just staring at me, his eyes." She broke off, choking back a sob. His eyes were just like that night. When we tried to calm her down, but I could see the fear in Sam's eyes, the unease in Neil's face. We all felt it, that something was here with us, something that knew the truth, something that had waited 10 years for us to return. The next day, we decided to leave. The lodge had taken on a life of its own, the shadows seeming to stretch longer, the walls pressing closer. As we packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That Tom, or whatever was left of him, was waiting for one last chance. Just as we were about to go, I felt a strange pull, like something was urging me to go to the basement. I hadn't even realized there was a basement, but the door was slightly ajar, leading down into darkness. Water trickled down the steps, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I went down the stairs. The air was thick, musty, and cold. I could barely see, but something caught my eye, a shadow in the corner. And then I saw him. Tom. Or what was left of him. He was hunched in the corner, his eyes hollow, his face pale and twisted with sorrow. He looked at me, his lips moving, but no sound came out. Water poured from his mouth, endless, eternal. He reached out one hand, and I saw the rope marks around his wrist. the rope we'd used that night. When the game went too far. When our joke turned into something else entirely. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, scrambling up the stairs, my heart pounding. The others were waiting at the top, their faces pale with fear. I saw him. I whispered, barely able to speak. He's still here. He knows. He remembers everything. We left without looking back, the silence of the lodge pressing down on us, as though it were watching, waiting for us to return. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Tom stood on the porch, water running down his face like tears, the rope still dangling from his wrists. It's been years since we went back to Cedar Creek Lodge. None of us talk about it. We pretend it never happened, that Tom really did drown that night. But deep down, we all know the truth. Cedar Creek still has him, and it always will. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear him calling my name, begging us to come back and free him. Not from the lake. We all know he's not in the lake. He's in the basement, where we left him, where our game went wrong, where a joke became a tragedy. But I know better than to go back. Because if we do, I'm not sure any of us will make it out alive. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, even if they never stop haunting us. Even if they never let us forget what we did that summer night at Cedar Creek Lodge. Tom's waiting there still, with the truth we can't face and the guilt we can't escape. And maybe that's our real punishment. Not that we killed him, but that we have to live with it. Every day, every night, forever. The lake keeps its secrets, but the basement knows the truth. I had heard about Blackwood Estate long before Mrs. Blackwood found my ad online and called to see if I'd be interested in house-sitting for a few months. The estate had been a source of local legend for as long as I could remember, whispered about in coffee shops and discussed in hushed tones at the town's only bar. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was built on ancient burial grounds. But no one seemed to have any concrete facts about the place or its mysterious owner. When Mrs. Blackwood called, her voice carried an authority that immediately commanded attention. She was a kind woman over the phone, polite but curt, like someone who didn't waste time with idle chit-chat. Her words were precise, measured, as if each one had been carefully selected before being spoken. "I've traveled the world over," she said in her clipped accent, which I couldn't quite place, somewhere between British and something else, something older. "And Blackwood is my only home. I expect it to be kept as such." The timing couldn't have been better. I was between jobs, having recently been laid off from my position at the local newspaper, and my savings were dwindling faster than I cared to admit. My apartment lease was ending, and the thought of spending my days at a sprawling estate sounded like a dream compared to my cramped studio. The pay was generous, too generous if I was honest, enough to cover 6 months of regular expenses in just a few weeks of work. But her brief tone discouraged questions, and desperation has a way of silencing doubt, so I accepted the offer without pressing for details. As I drove through the iron gates of Blackwood Estate 3 days later, the world seemed to shift. The bustling town I'd left behind faded into memory as dense woodlands closed in around me. Ancient oaks and towering pines created a natural barrier, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into strange, shifting patterns on the gravel driveway. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was different here. Blackwood Estate sat alone at the end of that winding driveway, like a monarch on its throne. The house itself was grand, Victorian maybe? I wasn't sure. Its architecture seemed to defy simple classification, combining elements from different periods in a way that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Multiple wings sprawled outward from the central structure, each one adding to the building's imposing presence. Its towering spires and intricate latticework, cast a looming silhouette against the pale autumn sky, giving me an odd feeling in my stomach, a mixture of awe and unease that I couldn't quite shake. The day I arrived, Mrs. Blackwood was there to greet me, standing on the steps with her cane in one hand and a gloved hand outstretched. She looked exactly as I'd pictured, silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, a trim figure draped in expensive black fabric, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. Those eyes were the most striking feature of her face, a peculiar shade of gray that reminded me of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. We shook hands, her grip surprisingly firm despite her age, and she showed me around the estate. The tour was extensive, winding through endless rooms, each one filled with antique furniture and delicate knickknacks that spoke of centuries of careful collection. Crystal decanters caught the light streaming through tall windows, sending prismatic rainbows dancing across dark wooden floors. Heavy velvet drapes framed each window, their deep burgundy color adding to the somber atmosphere. The place smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, with an underlying mustiness that no amount of cleaning seemed able to dispel. In the library, leather-bound books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines bearing titles in languages I didn't recognize. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and what appeared to be star charts. Mrs. Blackwood quickly gathered these up as we passed through, tucking them away in a drawer with a swift, practiced motion. "You're free to roam, of course," she said, her voice echoing faintly in the cavernous entryway as we concluded the tour. "But I suggest keeping to the main rooms." She gestured down the hall with her cane, the silver handle catching the light. "Upstairs, too, you'll find only the necessary rooms opened. The others—" She paused, her eyes fixing on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. "The others have been closed off for a reason." I wasn't sure what to make of that cryptic warning, but I didn't press her. I was already in awe of the place's grandeur, with its elegant staircase that swept upward in a graceful curve, intricate chandeliers that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and ceiling frescoes depicting scenes from classical mythology. Still, an odd heaviness lingered in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on my shoulders even as we walked together. Mrs. Blackwood left that same day, her driver pulling up in a sleek black car, just as the sun began to dip below the tree line. As her vehicle disappeared down the driveway, I turned to face the sprawling mansion, feeling a mixture of excitement and dread. The fading sunlight painted the windows in shades of amber and gold, but somehow the warm colors only made the house look more forbidding. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The silence had a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat. The usual background noise of city life, traffic, distant sirens, neighbors' televisions, was conspicuously absent, replaced by an absolute stillness that felt almost artificial. I made my rounds, checking the windows, securing doors, and familiarizing myself with the place. Shadows pooled in the corners of each room, stretching long across the wooden floors like dark fingers reaching out. The house groaned and creaked, the wind rattling against the ancient windows with an almost human-like moan. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was in an unfamiliar place and my mind was playing tricks on me. But even as I settled into the massive four-poster bed in what was to be my room, that feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if the walls themselves were observing me, silent and patient, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The ornate wallpaper with its intricate patterns of vines and flowers seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at it, everything was still. I awoke around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from the hallway outside my room, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against wood. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced myself to sit up, listening intently. The sound was regular, deliberate, almost like a heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet, and opened it just a crack. The hallway was empty, moonlight streaming through the tall windows and casting eerie shadows against the floral wallpaper. The shadows seemed to dance and twist, forming shapes that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. I was certain I was alone, but the tapping continued, faint but deliberate, leading down the hall toward the back stairs. My rational mind screamed at me to close the door, to return to bed and forget about the sound. But something else, something deeper and more primitive, urged me forward. I stepped out barefoot, my skin prickling with goosebumps as I followed the sound. It grew louder as I descended the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my feet despite my careful steps. The tapping led me to a closed door at the end of a narrow hallway, a hall I was certain hadn't been part of Mrs. Blackwood's tour. The wallpaper here was different, darker, its pattern more angular and unsettling. As I reached for the handle, brass cold beneath my fingers, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against me like a physical force. I hesitated, a strange fear paralyzing me, but curiosity won out over caution. I opened the door. It led to a small sitting room, one I hadn't seen during Mrs. Blackwood's tour. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single Victorian armchair facing a large, ornate mirror that dominated the far wall. Dust covered every surface, undisturbed by footprints or cleaning, and the air felt stale, heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place, something metallic and ancient, like old pennies and decay. Something about the mirror caught my eye. The glass was fogged, almost like a breath had passed across it, yet the room was as cold as stone. The mirror's frame was elaborate, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something strange. A faint outline, like the shape of a hand pressed against the glass from the other side. The sound of footsteps broke my trance, and I whirled around, my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, as silent as a tomb. Yet I could have sworn I heard the soft tap of shoes on wooden floors, moving away from me, up the stairs. I backed out of the room, closing the door carefully, and hurried back upstairs. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake and watching shadows move across the ceiling, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of the light, a product of an overactive imagination in an old house. Days passed, and I fell into a routine of sorts. By day, Blackwood was almost normal. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. I kept busy cleaning, exploring the less forbidding rooms, and enjoying the stunning view of the grounds from the conservatory. The gardens, though overgrown, held a wild beauty, with roses climbing the weathered trellises and ivy creeping up the stone walls. But the nights were different. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted, growing heavy with an unspoken presence. The shadows seemed to deepen, the silence became more profound, and that feeling of being watched intensified until it was almost unbearable. One night, I awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the murmuring of a distant crowd, coming from beyond my bedroom walls. The voices seemed to speak in languages I didn't understand, their words overlapping and intertwining in a disorienting chorus. I sat up, straining to hear, but as I focused on it, the voices would fade, leaving me in silence once again, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. It happened night after night. The voices grew clearer, sharper, and I could swear I heard my name being whispered. My name and the word leave repeated over and over like a mantra. The whispers seemed to follow me through the house, growing louder in certain rooms and falling silent in others, as if the very walls were trying to communicate something urgent. Then came the dreams. They were fragmented but vivid, painted in shades of shadow and moonlight. In them, I wandered the halls of Blackwood, lost and searching for something I couldn't name. The corridors stretched endlessly, doors opening onto impossible rooms filled with strange artifacts and shadowy figures that disappeared when I tried to look at them directly. Each dream ended the same way, with me standing before that mirror in the sitting room, the handprint on the glass more defined, like it was reaching out toward me, trying to bridge the gap between whatever lay on the other side and our world. I began to feel unsteady, disoriented. Time seemed to blur, day and night melting into each other until I wasn't sure how long I'd been at Blackwood. Hours felt like days, yet weeks passed like minutes. I could no longer shake the feeling that something in the house was watching me, guiding me, pulling me toward something terrible. The mirrors throughout the house began to trouble me. My reflection seemed wrong somehow, slightly out of sync with my movements, as if there was a delay between my actions and what I saw in the glass. Sometimes I caught glimpses of other figures in the mirrors, shadowy shapes that moved in the background, always just out of focus. On the final night, the sounds were louder than ever. The whispers had become a chorus, urgent and insistent, and footsteps echoed through the halls, soft but determined, leading me once again to the back stairs. My heart raced as I descended, dread twisting my stomach into knots. I tried to stop myself, to turn around, but it was as if some unseen force was guiding me, pushing me forward with gentle but inexorable pressure. I reached the sitting room, and this time, the door swung open of its own accord, the hinges crying out in protest. The sound echoed through the empty halls like a scream. Inside, the room was as cold as ice, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The mirror gleamed in the moonlight, casting a faint, sickly glow over the dust-covered furniture. The handprint was gone, replaced by something far more chilling. A message scrawled across the glass in dark, smeared letters that looked disturbingly like dried blood. You should have left. A figure appeared in the mirror, a shadowy, indistinct form with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with a faint, sickly green glow. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, lifting a finger to its lips as if to shush me. And then it began to step forward, the surface of the mirror rippling like disturbed water. My reflection wavered, distorted, as the figure moved closer, its mouth opening in a silent scream that seemed to suck the air from the room. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor. The shadow loomed over me, its face inches from mine, and I could feel an icy breath against my skin that smelled of earth and decay. "Why are you still here?" it whispered, its voice rasping like dry leaves scraping against stone. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating inside my skull. I scrambled to my feet, my mind blank with terror. I didn't know what it was, or why it was haunting me, but I knew I had to get out. The figure reached for me with hands that seemed more like claws, and I felt something cold brush against my cheek, leaving a trail of numbness in its wake. I ran, through the halls that seemed to stretch and twist, up stairs that felt endless, past windows that showed impossible scenes of writhing shadows and strange lights in the woods. Behind me, I could hear it following, its footsteps echoing mine in perfect synchronization. I left Blackwood that night, abandoning my things and running down the driveway in the pitch darkness. Branches whipped at my face as I fled, and more than once I stumbled over unseen obstacles, but fear drove me forward. When I reached the main road, I collapsed, gasping for air, feeling as though I had just escaped a nightmare. A week later, I received a letter from Mrs. Blackwood. The envelope was heavy, made of expensive paper, and sealed with dark red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. In it, she thanked me for my service, expressing her disappointment that I had left so abruptly. She made no mention of the haunting or the strange occurrences, only reminding me to leave the keys in the mailbox if I returned for my things. The letter was perfectly normal, except for a postscript written in a different hand, the ink darker and slightly smeared. "It misses you." I never went back to Blackwood, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that shadow in the mirror, those hollow eyes staring back at me. And when I pass by mirrors now, I could swear I see something moving in them, just at the edge of my vision, a dark shape that watches and waits, patient as the grave. I've started covering all the mirrors in my apartment at night, just to be safe. When I first arrived at Blackstone Abbey, it was hard to imagine that such a place could still exist, standing stubbornly on the edge of a cliff in the Scottish Highlands, battered by centuries of storms. The ancient stones seemed to absorb the weak autumn sunlight, casting an eternal twilight across its weathered facade. I'd seen pictures before, of course, but they hadn't done it justice. The abbey loomed against the backdrop of a sky thick with heavy, rain-laden clouds, its dark stone towers piercing the heavens, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The surrounding hills rolled away into the distance, covered in heather that swayed in the bitter wind like a purple sea. The drive up had been treacherous, the narrow road winding precariously close to the cliff's edge. My small rental car had struggled against the wind, which howled through the gaps in the windows like a banshee's wail. By the time I pulled into the gravel parking area, my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, and my nerves were already frayed. I'd been hired as part of a team of 3 to restore what was left of the Abbey's ancient murals. The paintings, faded and eroded by time, were rumored to hold clues to the Abbey's strange and troubled history. The project felt like a dream assignment at first. The place had an atmosphere of mystery, a feeling that there were secrets here that wanted to be uncovered. But soon the reality of Blackstone Abbey started to reveal itself, and the dream assignment twisted into something darker. The lead conservator on our team, Dr. Imogen Fraser, was a quiet woman with an impressive knowledge of ancient religious art. Her reputation preceded her. She'd restored medieval frescoes across Europe, and had written extensively about the symbolism in monastic art. She had been fascinated by Blackstone for years, captivated by the story of its last monk, a man known only as Brother Alasdair, who had reportedly gone mad from hearing the bells. According to legend, Brother Alasdair would pace the stone floors of the abbey's nave each night, clutching his head and wailing, swearing he could hear bells ringing from the depths of the earth. The bells were said to herald a curse laid upon the abbey centuries ago, a curse that condemned anyone who stayed too long within its walls. The local archives held fragmentary accounts of Brother Alasdair's descent into madness. Yellowed pages described how he would spend hours pressed against the cold stone floor, ear to the ground, muttering about the calling. Other monks reported hearing him conversing with unseen presences in the dead of night, his voice echoing through the empty corridors like a ghost's lament. Despite the chilling stories, Imogen seemed almost eager to be there. "It's just folklore," she had said, with a dismissive wave of her hand when I brought it up, her silver bangles jangling against her wrist. The bells symbolize the monk's guilt, nothing more. I doubt we'll find anything except old murals and drafty halls. She said it with a firm certainty that was supposed to reassure me, but all I could think of was how her voice had echoed in the vast, empty nave when she said it, almost as if someone, or something, had been listening. The words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating off the ancient stones before being swallowed by the shadows that lurked in the corners. Our work began the next day. We set up a makeshift lab in what had once been the Abbey's refectory, surrounded by crumbling walls and arched windows. The space still held echoes of its past, worn grooves in the stone floor where generations of monks had walked. scratches on the walls where wooden tables had once stood. The air was thick with dampness, and the only sound was the soft shuffling of our footsteps and the occasional creak of the ancient wooden beams overhead. It was an atmosphere that seemed to close in on you, a silence so profound it felt like the Abbey itself was holding its breath. Our third team member, David Chen, was a restoration specialist who'd worked with Imogen before. He was practical and methodical, his steady hands perfect for the delicate work of cleaning centuries of grime from the ancient paintings. But even he seemed affected by the Abbey's oppressive atmosphere, his usual cheerful demeanor growing more subdued with each passing day. As we worked, Imogen instructed us to approach the murals with care. They depicted scenes of saints and angels, their faces worn and faded, staring blankly from beneath layers of grime and dust. The paintings seemed to shift and change in the varying light, taking on different expressions as shadows moved across their weathered surfaces. One mural in particular caught my attention, a large fresco on the far wall of the nave. It showed a group of monks standing in a circle, their hands raised to the heavens, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. "What's the story behind this one?" I asked Imogen, but she only shook her head, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's strange," she said, running her gloved fingers lightly over the surface of the mural. "I've never seen anything like it in religious art. These monks, it's as if they're pleading, or perhaps..." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing as she examined the mural. "Perhaps they're trying to ward something off." Her words hung in the air like fog, and I noticed how the painted figures seemed to writhe in the flickering light of our work lamps. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures in the fresco were watching us. It was absurd, of course, but every time I glanced up, their blank eyes seemed to follow me. The more we cleaned, the more disturbing details emerged, subtle details that seemed wrong somehow. The monks' fingers were too long, their robes moving against an unseen wind, their faces caught in expressions that grew more agonized the longer you looked at them. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the longer we worked, the more oppressive the silence grew. The Abbey seemed to absorb all sound, creating a vacuum that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. Even the scraping of our tools against the stone walls seemed muffled, as if the very air was thick with something unseen. And then, just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the high windows, I heard it. A faint, distant ringing, like the chime of a bell echoing from deep within the Abbey. I froze, straining my ears, and felt a chill creep down my spine as the sound grew louder, then faded away, leaving behind a silence even more suffocating than before. The sound had a strange quality to it, not quite like any church bell I'd ever heard. Deeper, more resonant, with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Imogen didn't seem to notice, her attention fixed on the mural, her fingers brushing over the ancient paint like she was trying to coax a secret from it. I turned to David, but he only shrugged, muttering something about old pipes or structural settling. But that sound, that cold, metallic ringing, was unlike anything I'd ever heard in an old building before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if it originated from the very stones themselves. We packed up our equipment for the night, and as we made our way back to our rooms in the guest house nearby, the ringing started again. This time it was louder, almost urgent, reverberating through the Abbey's walls like a warning. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows of the nave, but there was no one there. Only the endless darkness of the Abbey's interior, broken by patches of pale moonlight streaming through the windows. As the days wore on, the ringing became a nightly occurrence, each chime growing louder, more insistent. Sometimes it would come in patterns, like a code I couldn't decipher. Other times it was a single, sustained note that seemed to pierce through my skull. The sound began to haunt my dreams, mixing with the faces from the murals until I could no longer tell what was real and what was imagination. And then, on the third night, the ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by something far more disturbing. It was just past midnight when I awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing down the stone corridor outside my room. The guest house was an old converted stable block, its thick walls usually muffling all sound. But these footsteps cut through the silence like knife strokes. At first I thought it was David, but as I lay there listening, I realized the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They moved in a slow, steady rhythm, growing louder with each passing second, stopping just outside my door. Holding my breath, I listened, feeling a suffocating dread creep into my chest. The footsteps had a peculiar quality. A dragging sound accompanied each step, as if whoever or whatever was out there was pulling something behind them. For what felt like hours, the footsteps remained, pacing back and forth outside my door, never venturing farther, never retreating. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they faded away, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence once more. The next morning I asked David and Imogen if they had heard anything, but they only exchanged uneasy glances. "It's an old building," Imogen said, brushing off my concerns. "The walls creak, the floors settle. It's all perfectly normal." But I noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her tools, how David's eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. But I knew, deep down, that what I had heard was anything but normal. And as we returned to our work that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of wind carrying with it the faint sound of bells. The faces in the murals appeared more animated than ever, their eyes following our movements across the room, their expressions growing more desperate with each passing hour. It was David who found the staircase. We were cleaning the base of the fresco, trying to remove a layer of grime that had built up over the centuries, when his hand brushed against something metallic embedded in the wall. A small brass ring, green with age, barely visible against the stone. He pressed on it, and with a grinding of stone that sent dust cascading from the ceiling, a narrow, hidden doorway opened, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Imogen was fascinated, her eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "This must lead to the Abbey's crypts," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "They would have been sealed off centuries ago." Her flashlight beam danced across the worn stone steps, illuminating centuries-old cobwebs and the remains of long-dead insects. Ignoring the nagging feeling of dread clawing at my stomach, I followed her down the staircase, my flashlight cutting through the thick, musty air. The further we descended, the colder it grew, the walls dripping with moisture, the stone steps slick beneath our feet. The air grew thick and stale, carrying the musty smell of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor lined with cells, each one sealed with rusted iron bars. Imogen moved slowly, her flashlight illuminating the dark, empty cells, her breath fogging in the cold. The cells were small, barely large enough for a person to lie down, with crude crosses scratched into their walls and floor. In some, we found remnants of wooden pallets that had served as beds, now rotted away to almost nothing. "This must have been the Abbey's punishment cells," she murmured, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. These weren't just cells for punishment. They were cells for containment, for isolation. The thick walls would have swallowed any screams, kept any secrets buried deep beneath the Abbey's foundations. It was in the last cell, that we found him. The skeleton lay slumped against the wall, his robes faded and tattered, his bony hands clasped together as if in prayer. But it was his face, or what was left of it, that froze the blood in my veins. The skull was twisted, the jaw hanging open in a silent scream, his eye sockets empty and hollow. Around his neck hung a heavy iron key, green with age, and clutched in his skeletal fingers was a small bell, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the beam of our flashlights. Imogen took a step back, her face pale. This must be Brother Alistair, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The mad monk. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. This wasn't madness we were looking at. This was terror in its purest form, preserved for centuries in these forgotten depths. As we stood there, staring at the remains, I felt a sudden wave of nausea, a deep, primal fear that clawed at my chest. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and I could hear the faint sound of bells, distant and ghostly, echoing from somewhere far below. The sound seemed to come from beneath the very foundations of the abbey, a calling that pulled at something deep within my soul. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Imogen nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The sound was different now, not just bells, but voices too, chanting in a language that had been dead for centuries. The words seemed to slither through the air like serpents, wrapping around us, drawing us deeper into the darkness. The bells grew louder, their chime hollow and mournful, as if they were calling to us, urging us to stay. Each toll seemed to shake the very foundations of the abbey, sending cascades of dust and small stones raining down from the ceiling. And then, without warning, the lights went out, plunging us into darkness so complete it felt like a physical presence. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking, my fingers numb with fear. The sound of the bells was deafening now, echoing through the crypt like a death knell, each chime reverberating in my bones. And then, over the ringing, I heard something else, a low, guttural whisper, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The words seemed to crawl across my skin like insects, each syllable burning with an otherworldly power. My flashlight flickered to life, and in its weak, sputtering beam I saw him, the ghostly figure of Brother Alistair, his face contorted in terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. He reached out, his bony fingers grasping at the air, his mouth moving soundlessly, as if he were trying to warn us, to tell us something we couldn't hear. Behind him, other figures began to materialize, the monks from the mural above, their faces twisted in the same expressions of horror, their hands raised in desperate supplication. I stumbled back, grabbing Imogen's arm, pulling her toward the staircase. But the bells were louder now, each chime a physical force, pressing down on us, driving us to our knees. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with the weight of centuries of suffering and secrets. And in that moment, I understood. The bells weren't just a warning. They were a curse, a call to join the lost souls of Blackstone Abbey, to remain trapped in its dark, twisted halls for all eternity. The ghosts of the monks surrounded us now, their forms flickering like candlelight, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for us with ethereal hands, trying to pull us back, to keep us here with them in their eternal torment. The bell in Brother Alistair's skeletal hand began to glow with an unholy light, its symbols pulsing with power. With a final burst of strength, I dragged Imogen up the stairs, the sound of the bells fading as we reached the top, their mournful chime echoing in my mind long after we had left the abbey. We ran through the nave, past the accusatory faces in the murals, out into the blessed darkness of the night. Behind us, the hidden door ground shut with a finality that seemed to seal away the horrors we had witnessed. We never spoke of what we saw in the crypt, but I knew that Imogen understood the truth as well as I did. Blackstone Abbey was cursed, its halls haunted by the ghosts of those who had come before us, their souls bound to the place by the relentless toll of the bells. The curse wasn't just a legend. It was a living thing, ancient and hungry, waiting in the darkness beneath the Abbey's foundations. And as I lay awake that night in my room at the guest house, listening to the silence, I could still hear the faint, distant chime calling to me, urging me to return. The sound followed me in my dreams, mixing with the faces of the ghostly monks, their eternal agony a warning to those who would dare to uncover the Abbey's secrets. But I knew I would never go back. Some mysteries are meant to remain buried. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And some bells are meant to toll forever in the darkness, calling to the unwary, promising answers but offering only damnation. The next morning, David was gone. His room in the guest house was empty, bed still made as if he'd never slept in it. His car remained in the parking area, covered in a thin layer of morning dew. All his equipment was still laid out in the refectory, tools arranged with his characteristic precision. He must have gotten spooked and called a taxi, Imogen suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We both knew there was no cell service this far up in the highlands, and the landline in the guest house had been dead for days. When I mentioned calling the police, she shook her head firmly. "And tell them what?" she asked, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver cross at her throat. "That we found a secret crypt? That we saw ghosts?" The bells continued their nightly chorus, but now they were accompanied by other sounds. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors, the rustle of robes against stone, and sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, the sound of David's voice, calling out for help from somewhere deep within the Abbey's walls. Imogen threw herself into her research with a desperate intensity. She spent hours poring over old manuscripts in the Abbey's small library, searching for any mention of the bells or the curse. The bells weren't always here, she told me one evening, her face illuminated by candlelight as another power outage plunged the guest house into darkness. They were brought to the Abbey in 1542, just before the Reformation. They were said to have the power to call forth something. The text isn't clear about what exactly, but whatever it was, the monks thought they could control it. They were wrong. A week after David's disappearance, I found Imogen in the nave well past midnight. She was standing before the mural, her hand pressed against the stone, mumbling something under her breath. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with vacant eyes, her pupils dilated to black pools. "Can't you hear them?" she whispered. "They're trying to tell us something important." Her other hand clutched Brother Alistair's bell, its symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. The bells began to toll then, louder than ever before, and Imogen smiled, a terrible, empty expression that had nothing of humanity in it. That was when I ran. I left everything behind, my equipment, my notes, even my car keys. Behind me, the bells reached a crescendo, their sound mixing with Imogen's laughter and other darker sounds that I try not to remember. When the police finally investigated, they found the Abbey empty. There was no sign of David or Imogen, no evidence of our work there, not even the hidden door to the crypt. The murals remained, but they had changed again. Now they showed not just the monks, but two new figures among them, their faces contorted in expressions of eternal torment. Last week, I received a letter. The envelope contained no return address, but I recognized Imogen's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. "The bells ring." Below these words was a crude drawing of a bell covered in familiar symbols. I burned the letter immediately, but its arrival has awakened something in me. The dreams have returned. Dreams of dark corridors and endless stairs, of ghostly monks and ancient curses. I know now that somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, in a place where ancient stone meets stormy sky, the bells of Blackstone Abbey continue to toll. They ring for David and Imogen, for Brother Alasdair and all those who came before. And someday, I fear, they will ring for me too. And in the darkness of my room as I write these words, I can hear them, very faintly, beginning to chime.